Hi, I'm Nolan, and this video is about the recently surfaced Black Sabbath song Slapback and other musical material that became the song Walk Away from the album Heaven and Hell. The recording from this cassette tape was posted last Friday on YouTube. Because Slapback is written on the tape and Ronnie repeats the word slapback on the chorus, it is safe to assume that this was the title of the song. At first listen, the song seems very non-Sabbath-like, which is probably why there is a question mark on that video. But as you will see in my presentation, parts of the song were repurposed for use in the song Walk Away. I discuss in my book, Experiencing Black Sabbath, A Listener's Companion, how in the mid to late 70s, they were incorporating sounds of Ameriprog or prog light and what some might call corporate rock into their music. Sometime in early fall 1979, not long after Slapback was recorded, Ozzy predicted the new lineup would probably sound like Foreigner. From Never Say Die, 1978, there are parts from Shockwave and Over to You that are in this vein, as well as moments on Heaven and Hell. Upon first hearing of Slapback, I thought it might be a cover, but then I noticed a striking similarity to one of the songs off of Heaven and Hell. The first thing I notice about Slapback is that it modulated back and forth between D major and A major, and that it started and ended in A. I remember that Walk Away did the same thing. Key changes are common in Sabbath's music, but not in this way, and not to closely related keys, so it stuck out in a way. I must clarify that Walk Away is in A flat and D flat, but I'm saying A and D in case you'd like to play along on guitar and you wouldn't have to transpose. Now, the recording of Slapback is somewhere between A and A flat. I don't know if that was an issue with how they were tuned that day, or perhaps the tape speed of when they recorded it, or maybe there's an issue of the tape speed when it was transferred to digital, but I'm going to assume it was tuned down a half step, because that's how they're tuning at that time. So I've just slowed down the recording just a little bit to make Slapback in A flat and D flat. I also noticed a similarity of form, and I've made a diagram to illustrate that. Although this similarity may not seem like much just yet, bear with me, because its importance will become clear by the end of this presentation. Notice how in both songs, the same material is used for the beginning and the ending. The only difference is that in Walk Away, the material from the intro comes back in the middle of the song. I then listened very carefully to material used in both songs and discovered that there are some commonalities, so it became clear that material from Slapback was repurposed for use in Walk Away. You'll see that material from the intro, labeled here in orange, was modified for use as the intro and post-chorus of Walk Away, labeled in red. Only a very small portion, and I mean very small, of the chorus of Slapback was used for the chorus of Walk Away. This is labeled in green. And lastly, although the material is different, the concept of using a darker minor mode and bluesy sound to contrast the very major sounding rest of the song was retained from Slapback to Walk Away. Next, I'm going to demonstrate on the guitar how the material from Slapback evolved to what it became in Walk Away. But I must warn you that guitar is not my primary instrument. In fact, it's my fourth. So please excuse my technique. This is for demonstration purposes only. I'm showing here the harmonic structure of the intro to Slapback to illustrate how it was retained for the Walk Away intro, although riffs are a bit different. We're in the key of A, we get the 1 chord, and then the 4 chord with a 4-3 suspension. Now to the 1 chord, then it's the 4-3 again, and then the 1 chord, voice for the A on top. And compare that to the Walk Away intro riff. Notice in Walk Away that the 4 chord has the same 4-3 suspension as Slapback. It has the B above. And then goes to the A. Does it again. And like Slapback goes to the A. It has the C sharp on top and the open D. This is that harmonic sound that they were going for in the late 1970s. Now, you may have noticed a striking similarity to the transitional verse in Shockwave from Never Say Die. This would be at 1 minute and 15 seconds. Here, I've illustrated the harmonic structure of both, and listen how similar they are. Shockwave. Regarding the guitar tone found in Shockwave and Slapback, Walk Away, and songs by other bands of the late 1970s, the thinness of the guitar is due in part to the riffs being played in a much higher register than your typical Sabbath riff, particularly on these upper strings. And moreover, 2-note chords that aren't power chords, dyads, that became an important part of 80s hard rock. The intro riff for Walk Away comes back as the pre-chorus, but the end of it is different. It begins the same, but notice how it goes to the flat 7 chord, the G, then to a 4-6, the D over F sharp. That's the same figure found in Rush's Fly By Night. Right here. It's just in a lower key when Sabbath does it. It's that same walk-up, too. And both chords have that sus chord sound. So Sabbath has this, Rush has this. So it's that sus chord sound that Tony was going for at the time. The next bit from Slapback that was repurposed for use in Walk Away is very hard to notice, very subtle. It happens 3 times in each of the 3 choruses of Slapback, but only once in the Walk Away chorus. So here, Tony plays a very early rock and roll figure. That's where you play the power chord. And you have the 5th, moving up to the 6th and back is a neighbor tone. So Slap, back. Slap, back. By using the same figure, the context is different, not just because the feel is different, swung versus straight, but the choruses are in different keys. The Slapback chorus is in D, and every time they go to the 4 chord, the G, Tony plays that figure. And then when that same G chord appears in the Walk Away chorus, but as a flat 7 in A, he plays the same figure. Because that rock and roll figure only happens once in the Walk Away chorus, it's right before Ronnie sings She's Looking to Love You, it's not as obvious as in Slapback, where it happens 3 times. The blues-based 1-4 altering chord progression in the chorus was not used for Walk Away, nor was the vocal melody. This high D-flat sounding is at the top of Ronnie's practical vocal range. That is the highest note that he sings on the Heaven and Hell album. He does it in several songs, but only briefly, not repeated like in this chorus. Notice in the second chorus of Slapback, he takes the melody down a 4th to A-flat. This is the register that he usually sings in. The third element they took from Slapback for use in Walk Away is more conceptual. They took the idea of having a darker minor mode middle section to contrast the more major mode main parts of the song. In both songs, it switches to the minor pentatonic, sometimes with an added flat 5 to give it a minor blues flavor. This is to contrast the very major mode sounding sections of the rest of the song. The interlude begins with a very classic Sabbath sounding riff. I call it classic Sabbath mostly because it's based on the minor blues scale and that it is very reminiscent of Sabracadabra. Both riffs emphasize the root at the top of the scale They both have pickups to the downbeat, swung feel. Yeah, and then they both descend the bottom half of the blues scale in the same rhythm. In Sabracadabra, it's on the beat. 2, 3, 4. And in Slapback, it starts on 2. 2, 3, 4, 1. Sabracadabra is actually in a different key, but it's the same idea. Walk Away also makes a sudden shift to minor pentatonic. So it too has a classic Sabbath middle section surrounded by the late 70s sound. Okay, at this point, you may be wondering what were the other origins for Walk Away. We've only covered a few sections so far, and yet there are so many unanswered questions about both songs. So let's take a quick look at the other parts of Slapback. The solo section is 17 bars and is in minor. This asymmetry comes from the inserted measure of the F and G chords, which is a sequence of the previous C and D chords. These are played in triplets. You may recognize this from Rush's Anthem. It has the same chord progression of 1, flat 3, 4, flat 6, flat 7, and back to 1. It also has the same quarter note triplet accents. Oddly enough, it's from the same album mentioned earlier. I doubt this was intentional, but it stuck out to me. Other than retaining the concept of going to minor and having a darker sound, this material was not used in Walk Away. Here is the 4-bar pattern for the verses of Slapback. The chords are typical for a rock progression, nothing too notable here. However, when the chords are syncopated on the end of 2, it gives it a bit of a rockabilly feel. That brings me to my next point. Listen to the bass on the 4th chord. It outlines the tonic major chord, A, C sharp, E. This is very un-Geezer-like, by the way. I wonder if this was Ronnie's or Jeff's bass line. In fact, much of the recording is unlike Geezer. There are certain passages, like between vocal phrases, where Geezer would have played a bass fill, and several other passages where Geezer would have likely chosen different pitches to play. Outlining the major chord in that specific rhythm definitely signifies rockabilly or early rock and roll. Think Elvis, Hound Dog. Ain't nothing but a hound dog. Or Eddie Cochran, 20 Flight Rock. Well, I've got a girl with a record machine. Okay? Let's think about the song title for a moment. Slapback. When I think of Slapback, I think of Slapback Echo. Yeah? I think of rockabilly, rock and roll, Sam Phillips, Elvis, Sun Studios, right? Sabbath will often have nicknames for their songs during the writing process, especially before they have lyrics. I seriously wonder if they called the song Slapback, one word, not two, before any lyrics were written, due to these rock and roll references in the song, and then Ronnie used the temporary song title for the chorus and then wrote the rest of the words. At any rate, they didn't use the verse material for Walk Away. Instead, they used other material, primarily from one other song in their rehearsals. It's an untitled song, but I refer to it as Lord, She's Handsome, because that's one of the few lyrics from the song that were used for Walk Away. A noticeable difference in the two songs is that this one does not change key. It stays in D throughout. And that's where Slapback comes in. Although much of the material comes from Lord, She's Handsome, they abstracted the modulation structure from Slapback and applied it to Walk Away. The formal structure in these two songs are nearly identical. Intro, verse, chorus, post-chorus, verse 2, bridge, middle section, chorus, and then post-chorus repeated to end it. The main difference concerning the form is how the material used in each of those sections returns. In Lord, She's Handsome, the intro riff only returns as a background figure for what would have likely been a guitar solo, whereas in Walk Away, the intro riff is used as the post-chorus and ending of the song, a formal structure based on Slapback as discussed earlier. Even more significant than the formal similarities is that much of the material was used for Walk Away, albeit revised. This diagram illustrates this. Shown in blue, Elements from the second part of the intro were used for the verse riff of Walk Away and the first part of the interlude. Shown in orange, the verse and post-chorus riff from Handsome was reworked and became the verse riff of Walk Away. There are similarities between the choruses of both songs in respect to the harmony, and that's shown in red. Both bridges are 9 bars long, but the chords are reordered, and that's shown in green. The riff used in the first part of the intro is used as a background figure for what likely would be a guitar solo. It goes like this. Notice the dark minor mode character of that riff that contrasts the more brighter major mode rest of Walk Away. I would argue that this takes on the same function as the minor pentatonic riff behind the solo in Walk Away, that is, to provide contrast pitch-wise. Now, I'm going to walk you through these riffs to illustrate how they evolved into what we know as Walk Away. The second riff of the intro contains elements that ended up in the verse riff and first interlude riff in Walk Away. Notice that we have the same G over D to D progression, the 4 chord in A with the 2 suspensions. This is the same chord I discussed earlier, so it also has similarities with Slapback. This same progression reappears in the first part of the Walk Away interlude. This is where Ronnie is finishing the word wire. The F to C chords in the second half of the riff are also used in that interlude. The difference is that the chords are condensed from 4 bars to just 2. The clearest similarity of Handsome and Walk Away is the verse and post-chorus riff of Handsome being reworked for use as the verse riff of Walk Away, and a small element of it reworked as the riff behind the guitar solo. It is very similar to the riff in Walk Away. Here, it's a 4-bar phrase. In Walk Away, it's an 8-bar phrase divided 4 and 4, but with different endings, so I've labeled them as A and A prime. Let me play you that riff. Did you recognize that last lick? That is the Layla Lick. I suspect that is one of the reasons why this part of the riff was revised for Walk Away. In its place in measure 4 of the riff is a quick C chord with a 4-3 suspension figure, which seems to have come from the second riff of the intro when the F chord changes to the C chord. In place of the Layla Lick in measure 8, which is why I have it labeled A prime, is what I call the Tomorrow's Dream turnaround. That's where you have the 5 to the flat 7 on beats 3 and 4. You'll see that I crossed out the moving line in the third measure. That was changed as well. What I find most astonishing about the removal of the Layla Lick is that it was reimagined for later in the song. The second part of the interlude begins with a minor pentatonic lick, drastically changing the harmonic color of the song. These are the same notes as the Layla Lick, A, C, D, F, D, C, just in a different rhythm. A, C, D, F, D, C, and so on. Even the discarded bit in measure 3 is related. The C, D, F. To end the solo section, the backing riff goes down the D minor blues scale, recalling the slapback interlude in an abstract way. Then we get what I call the Purple Haze Lick, which is the 5th, 7th, and sharp 9 of these so-called appendix chords. Here, E, G, C in the key of A. This helps us modulate back to the key of A for the return of the chorus. The choruses of these two songs are quite different, with Lord She's Handsome having a Zeppelin-y feel from Tony and Bill. What they have very much in common, however, is the harmonic structure of the dominant, the 5. In Handsome, we are on 5, A, but in Walk Away, having established the key of D, we are in 5, in the key of A. In Walk Away, it sounds at first like we're on A, but we soon realize that we've modulated, but that we're in A. And remember, we have that little rock and roll G chord from Slapback in the Walk Away chorus as well. I find it very interesting that the two bridges use a different chord progression, but they retained the length of the bridge at 9 bars, and in both cases it feels divided like 7 plus 2. They essentially reorder the 1, 4, and 5 chords. Regarding the 7 plus 2 structure, bars 8 and 9 of Handsome are on the 5 chord, but bars 8 and 9 of Walk Away are on the 1. And by the way, the use of 1, 4, and 5 chords is one of the reasons why these songs sound more poppy than other Sabbath songs, which use a very different harmonic language. Now, for the Walk Away analysis, I put the 4 to 1 chords in parentheses because even though this is what Tony is playing, there are other musical things happening that make it seem like the harmony is prolonging the 5 chord. From that perspective, we can then hear a similarity to the chorus of Handsome as well, as it stays on the 5 for so long. And with that, I will now revise the diagram to show that the 5 pedal from the choruses of Handsome are now found in the bridge. I hope it has become clear that elements of both Slapback and what I call Lord She's Handsome were fused into what we have known for over 40 years now as Walk Away. This diagram attempts to summarize where material was repurposed from these two songs to create Walk Away. It's clear from this diagram that Lord She's Handsome is essentially an early version of Walk Away, as so much more from it was used than from Slapback. But there were important elements from Slapback that were used, namely the key change structure and the bookending of the intro riff. I tell my composition students all the time to really examine the ideas that they come up with. Look at that material. How can it be developed? How can it be reworked, revised, repurposed, even on an abstract level? What I have presented is evidence that Sabbath saw potential in two songs in their infancy, and through their composition and songwriting mastery, created a much stronger song because of it. And they also recognize that some of the material had to go. Sometimes as a composer or songwriter, it's difficult to throw something away, but that's just as important. Tony often describes their songwriting as jamming and coming up with a riff, but the more I study rehearsal and studio outtakes, the more it has become evident that it's so much more than that. I suppose one could summarize their process as come up with a riff and get on from there, as he recently described the writing process for Walk Away to songfacts.com, but there's clearly much more thought and work put in than implied by these rather modest comments. Studying recordings such as these is the popular music equivalent to what is called sketch studies in musicology. Just as one studies the sketches for a symphony to gain insight into the composer's process, a popular musicologist studies these kinds of recordings to gain the same type of insight. I really do hope more of these recordings come to surface. Fans want to hear them, I want to study them. I hope this presentation demonstrated not only how Sabbath evolved their songs, but also the value of making these recordings, or composer sketches if you will, making them available. Thanks for listening, fellow Sabbath fans. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me at my work address. Check out my other Sabbath videos on my YouTube channel. I have some on the Heaven and Hell rehearsal tape, the flute on Born Again, a discarded riff from 1972, another band named Black Sabbath, and other videos. Also, my book, Experiencing Black Sabbath, A Listener's Companion, covers so much about their music not covered in the existing Sabbath literature. It's available from online sellers such as Amazon or directly from the publisher Rowman and Littlefield. And it's reasonably priced for the general reader considering it's from an academic publisher. And don't worry, there's not so much theory jargon like in this video in that book. I wrote the book for you, Sabbath fans, and without any assumption of any musical training. So thank you so much for watching my video.